we flew to a test consulting house down in Houston, me and my manager, and we went and asked them to help us solve this problem. And they had this really weird, revolutionary idea.
Welcome to the LabVIEW Experiment. I'm your host, Sam Taggart from SAS Workshops. If you're a developer looking to unlock your potential and take your skills to the next level, then look no further. From freeing your imagination and experimenting with new ideas and workflows, to exploring aspects of software development you've never even considered before, I'm going to help you grow your craft so you can approach your work like an artist and have more fun with what you do. In my 15 years working with and training developers, I've helped dozens of individuals and organizations embrace a growth and learning mindset that allows us to overcome challenges and embrace failure as the essential learning experience it is. If you're ready for the philosophies, strategies, tips, and tricks that will unlock your creativity, then it's time to get to work. So I am here today with John Giannangeli of Boulder Software. If you've been around the LabVIEW community, you might know John. He's been around for a while. Some of you might know him as Johnny Icon from the forums. John is one of the more underappreciated people in the LabVIEW community. I think he does a whole lot, but I don't think people realize it. He's helped with the alarm community here in Denver quite a bit and organizing that. He's helped with GDevCon lately, GDevCon NA. And he's also on Lyle's consultant board, trying to make things better for us consultants. So I just want to say, John, I see everything you do and I appreciate you. So I will make sure you know that.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me to the podcast. Really, really happy to be here. Can't wait to get into some discussion.
Yeah, you were one of the first LabVIEW people that I met when I moved out to Denver.
Yeah, I remember.
I think Joe Zoller was one of the people that I first talked to, and he just kind of disappeared. But then you and Dave and a bunch of the other people kind of took me under their wings, and you've given me a lot of advice. You're very much the consummate businessman and always thinking about business stuff and processes and things like that. And yeah.
Yep. Well, I kind of learned that from just pulling up my bootstraps and starting my own business. I didn't really know anything about it when I started. Went out and got an accountant and a lawyer, and it taught me a few things, and then kind of learned the rest on my own, how to do the financial billing collection and how to do, any marketing that I've done, which by the way, hasn't been a whole lot. Getting logos, brand name out, those types of things. Just kind of learn from scratch. I absolutely knew zero when I started.
I think that's the case with most LabVIEW consultants. Like, I think most of them, they're really good at LabVIEW, and then they either move or get fired, or not fired, but whatever, quit their job, whatever, decide they can go do it on their own. And then, it's interesting because I think they don't realize how much other stuff there is to running a business besides just writing code. I think that's the big problem why a lot of people quit, because they just wanted to write code.
Yeah.
And they realize all the other stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot more to it than just writing code, for sure.
Yeah.
You end up being sort of the chief cook and bottle washer.
Yeah, the CEO, the chief everything officer.
Yeah.
That's the way I refer to it. Yeah.
But it's been fun. It's been great. It's, working for yourself is very rewarding and very, very flexible. So I think it's a good thing.
Yeah. No, and I definitely owe a lot to you and Dave Thompson and some of the other consultants around here have definitely helped me out and pointed me in the right direction. And I feel like in the LabVIEW community, at least here in Denver, it's very cordial and it's not like this cutthroat competition thing. We all kind of help each other out. And I think everybody's kind of sub for everybody else at some point in time.
Probably. Yeah, we have a good community here in Colorado. I assume other communities around the country are similar, but ours is kind of exemplary, I would say. In fact, at one point when we were still doing our own community website with Alarm, and I had kind of reached out to us and said, hey, you guys are kind of a model user group and we want to do what you're doing. And I eventually took over the community websites, and we don't have the Alarm website anymore. We have a group called Alarm on the NI forums or the NI communities. And, but prior to that, I think they looked to us as being a leader in, how to do that right. And I didn't start that organization, but I joined it pretty early on. And Dave Thompson and Laurel Watts were really the original founders of that community, and Buddy Hahn. And, they all did a great job of pulling a community together. And at one point they're like, we don't want to do the website anymore. Who wants to take it over? I was like, I'll do it, because I was really into websites at the time. I was doing probably a dozen different websites, and I was like, yeah, I can do that. I used a program called PHP Nuke way back then, if you've ever heard of that, an old content management system. I've moved beyond that at this point. I don't use that anymore, and I don't do a whole lot of web design anymore or web maintenance. I do a little bit as I need to for my several businesses that I have.
Yeah, I was gonna say you do a bunch of stuff besides just LabVIEW too, don't you?
I do. Some of them are kind of dormant. Like my guitar, my music one is Shredworks, and it's been back burner for over a decade now. It's just something I can't seem to get to.
Yeah.
I have another one called IT Works, which is sort of IT support and reselling hosting and things like that. And that was a very active business for a while, actually boots on the ground type of business. I had several employees going out and doing IT support at various customers around the Colorado area. Now I've kind of backed off. I've kind of turned it down on purpose because I don't really want to keep doing that type of business. But I still do resell hosting and things like that. It's not a real huge money maker, but hey, it's something. It's another revenue stream. So yeah, I've got those three things. My wife just started up another business as well. So we got our hands full.
Very entrepreneurial family.
Yeah.
Very cool. That's good. So you started not in LabVIEW, did you? Right? You started at Exabyte, or what were you doing before that? You were at
actually
Sun,
my first job out of college was at Sun Microsystems in the Bay Area, and I started as a failure analysis engineer. Or really more of, I guess I would call it more like debug. And this was in the heyday of Spark, Sun Spark, and prior to .com, about 10 years prior to .com. And they were starting up their manufacturing process for Spark 1 and 2, and hired a bunch of us guys out of college to come out and help them debug boards that were piling up and not working. So that's how I learned how to debug workstations and
but that was in like using Linux or Unix or something, and not LabVIEW?
Yeah, they didn't have Solaris at the time. Eventually Solaris became their operating system brand, but it was a flavor of Unix. I think it was called Sun OS back then. And in fact, that's where I started programming on LabVIEW on Sun OS.
Wow.
Instead of Windows. Now at that point, I'd moved back to Colorado. I'm from Colorado. Actually, I'm from Canada, but that's another story. I moved to Colorado when I was 6 months old, so I'm essentially from Colorado. When I moved back, I went to Exabyte and started doing more test engineering type activities. And we were building a new test system. This is when I met Nancy and Brian Powell, probably around 1992. And I started, maybe 93, I started taking my first LabVIEW class. And they introduced us to this add-on package called the Test Executive Toolkit, which eventually became TestStand. And we were designing our test rack and our test platform. And for some reason, I was the youngest guy in the group, probably the least experienced guy in the group. But for some reason, I had my manager's ear, and all the other guys wanted to do .NET. I don't even think they had .NET back then. It was probably C++, and they wanted to do that on Windows. And we were going to deploy this globally, like manufacturing in Malaysia at a contract manufacturer. So I had my manager's ear, and I convinced them to use Sun workstations and LabVIEW on Sun OS with the Test Exec Toolkit. And it actually worked really well. We were able to pull our data collection off our board test in Malaysia, in Boulder, and do statistical analysis and the types of things you do with test data, process capability, those
Yeah,
types
like
of things.
detecting which parts fail most often and how often they fail. And
Yeah.
like find some leading indicators and things like that.
Yep. So we did that, and it was a huge success. And after I left Exabyte, that was in service for long after I left Exabyte. Yeah.
So you were telling me that not everything always went well at Exabyte, right? You have a story about an experiment that didn't work?
Well, actually, it did work. It didn't work at first. So your question for me for the podcast was an experiment that I'd done in the past that didn't turn out quite the way I expected.
Yep.
So again, I was probably the least experienced engineer in the group, and because I was the youngest, I was the newest, and I was still learning test engineering, and they put me on a product that was a preamplifier on a tape drive. And it just so happens the designer of the preamp in the design group was also a young guy who was not very experienced in analog. If you know anything about analog, it's a little bit like RF, where it's a very specialized black magic type of thing that not everybody gets good at unless they really are passionate about it. And so this guy was coming up through the ranks, learning analog from the old guys that knew it and were good at it. They were mentoring him, and he designed this preamp that had this ridiculous gain of 1,000, and it was really sensitive.
So super noisy.
Really, really noisy, really sensitive, and it tended to oscillate. No matter what you hooked up to it, it would just start oscillating. Well, I had to put it into a test fixture with the, pogo pins that you would put into a board functional test or an in-circuit test type of fixture. And those probes are, a couple inches long. You can get shorter ones. There's tons of probes out there, and I'm sure they've evolved over time. I don't really do a lot of that stuff anymore, but we tried to build a fixture with traditional pogo pins. We even tried using like a coax one so it was shielded, and we spent a lot of money on specialized pogo pins and all, and it just was not going to work.
Yeah.
Just wasn't going to happen. Oscillated every time. It took us months to build this fixture, maybe even more than a year. At any rate, we flew to a test consulting house down in Houston, me and my manager, and we went and asked them to help us solve this problem. And they had this really weird, revolutionary idea. So the circuit was I'll use my hands. The circuit's like this round, flexible circuit board with a tail coming off of it with edge fingers on it. Okay. It's not nearly as big as my hand. It's really about as big as like an M.2 drive type size. And the fingers, edge fingers were off. Also, the whole thing is a flexible circuit that plugs into a little like ZIF connector or something.
Okay, so they're little gold-plated things. Yeah.
So what we ended up doing is mirroring those finger edges onto another circuit board below it, and roughing up the surface by plating it with what they called, air quote, diamond dust. Literally grinding up diamonds into fine little granules and plating it onto that surface of the hard circuit board underneath. So the hard circuit board is the test interface.
Yeah, are diamonds very conductive then, I guess? I've never really...
Then they would plate that with silver or something else over the top of it, right? Okay. So you'd end up getting this roughed up, instead of a flat finger edge like you'd have on a circuit board, it was very rough.
Yeah.
And with lots of contact points.
Yeah.
So then you would compress that with flexible circuit board onto the test interface board, and your probe length is now virtually zero, or at least negligible, right? Mm-hmm. So it worked. Amazingly, that thing stopped oscillating, and we were able to get good signals out of it.
Well, I had a similar problem when I was at Westinghouse. They had a circuit board tester, and it had like the flying probe. But the wire going from the flying probe acted like a big antenna. And so like you would touch spots in the circuit and you would actually end up like injecting tiny bits of current and stuff, and it would cause problems. So that was always interesting. So yeah, getting rid of that probe length probably helps a lot.
Yeah, it was huge. It was a really good breakthrough, and that was a successful test fixture once we got through all that. And we used LabVIEW and TestStand to take all the measurements. We used a network analyzer for people who aren't into instrumentation, like analog instrumentation. A network analyzer has nothing to do with a network. It's really more of a RF network. Like how you would measure like the bandwidth of a circuit, like from 0 to 5 gigahertz, or in this case, probably more like way back then on a tape drive, probably more like 500 megahertz.
I was going to say, things were way slower back then.
Or maybe even less than that. I don't remember what the bandwidth was, but it definitely wasn't RF type stuff. It was just analog, analog wires, nothing through the air. At any rate, it was a GPIB instrument, and just take measurements off LabVIEW, program the Skippy commands, set it up, take the measurements. It all worked out great.
Cool. You said you were using TestStand on that too then to sequence
Well,
stuff?
so TestStand wasn't a product yet. TestStand was still the add-on toolkit known as the Test Executive Toolkit. It was essentially the same idea. It was just not its own product.
So I have a question because when I worked at Westinghouse, I worked on a circuit board tester. I mentioned it used a bastardized, I don't know if that's the correct term, but basically it was like somebody took Test Executive and like modified it to be slightly different and used it. And they had text files that like listed all the commands. Is that like the way that Test Executive works, or is that part of their modification?
Well, you're definitely stretching my memory because that was almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, because I don't know exactly what was Test Executive and what was whatever they had modified it. So.
It was a lot like TestStand where you would have
steps.
You would have callbacks and you would have, code modules. And it was basically the same infrastructure of TestStand in a very less mature format. It wasn't a mature product yet, right? It was still just in its infancy. But it did the same types of things. It did all the data collection for you. It did, it was basically designed so that an operator could say, go, start and put the serial number in and go, and as it pass fail, right? Very little operator interaction.
So you're a testing guru. So can you explain for the audience, like what, trying to pick the right tool for the job, like why would you use LabVIEW or would you use TestStand? How do they work together?
Yeah, it's kind of a game time judgment call. You go out, you check out what the customer's doing. I always offer, multiple solutions or at least those two. I mean, once you choose LabVIEW, then you have to pick your architecture. But if you're picking between LabVIEW and TestStand, it's like, okay, here's the two things. I think TestStand is capable of doing a lot, and I'm really into TestStand. I would not use the term guru as you just did. I'm good at it and I'm proficient, and I'm comfortable, and I've used it for a long time, and I enjoy using it, and I see it as being the right solution in a lot of scenarios. Where it's maybe not the right solution is in more of an R&D. I mean, you can certainly use it in R&D. I think you could use it anywhere, but in fact, I've even thought about using it for testing software APIs, right?
I don't think you're the first person to do that. I think there are posts on the NI forums definitely about people doing that.
Yeah, I'm sure there are. I mean, it's totally suited.
It would work.
Yeah, it'd be great. It's a great way to automate stuff like that. But when you're in the lab and you're, the design engineer's sitting next to you and he wants to see, he wants to poke at things and he wants to see things, TestStand's probably not the right solution.
Yeah.
TestStand's more for high volume manufacturing, those types of scenarios.
So here's a question for you, because here's where I think I see people making mistakes is if you've got a LabVIEW program and it's doing something that has a series of steps, at what point do you say, okay, I'm going to write the sequencer in LabVIEW versus I'm going to write the sequencer in TestStand? And how do you, because I feel like people sometimes get that wrong.
Yeah. So, I don't think of it as writing a sequencer in TestStand because TestStand
is a sequencer.
So at that point, all you're responsible for is the tests, the code modules. And I think Alan's been quoted as saying that his job is to rewrite TestStand over and over and over or something like that.
Yeah, because I see lots of people putting lots of effort into writing sequencers in LabVIEW, and I'm like, at some point there's a crossover point where it makes sense to go to TestStand.
Yeah.
And there's an investment in learning TestStand. It's not the most intuitive, I think. Well, I don't know. I take that back. It's somewhat intuitive, but the problem is there's so many different ways to do things, and trying to figure out the best way to do things and navigating that interface, I find challenging.
Yeah, and you have to understand what the different process models do and why you would even want to use them. And yeah, there's a lot to it. It's not trivial. But yes, I do think a lot of, and this is an age-old discussion, by the way. Anybody who's going to see this podcast is going to go, "Oh yeah, that old discussion," right? And there's people in multiple camps there. There's the people that are like, "I'm never using TestStand. I'm always going to write my own thing in LabVIEW," and then there's people somewhere in the middle, like, "Well, I can do either one," and then there's people that are like, "Yeah, I'm a TestStand guy." So I'm not I'm not in any one camp. I'm flexible. I'm
Yeah.
good to just help the customer get what they want done.
So I try not to be too dogmatic on either of those fronts. I think that when you're really dogmatic, I think you get into problems. But I think part of it is sometimes people are more familiar with one tool over the other. So if you are a LabVIEW programmer, right, like even if TestStand might be a better choice, the learning curve of trying to learn it and vice versa, I think that sometimes leads us in different directions. Like when you have a really good hammer, everything looks like a nail kind of problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like I said, I think TestStand is useful in a lot of scenarios. But it's a tough sell. When I present it to my customers, most of them kind of shy away from it. Like, first of all, they don't know what it is. And when I try to explain to them what it is, or even just run a demo for them on my laptop in their shop or whatever, they're like, yeah, I'm not interested. So and other customers are like, we definitely want TestStand. We don't want anything else.
Yeah.
Right. So ultimately, your job as a consultant is to help your customers solve their problem the way they want to, unless you think you have a better idea and you can convince them of that.
Yeah, I was going to take this a different direction, but I like that. So like thinking about like as a consultant, what we do. And I think part of it is making sure that they understand the options and all the trade-offs. And then you step out of the way and you say, I've presented all the options. This is one I recommend. You guys choose what you want to do.
Yeah.
And then if they choose something else and choose to drive the bus off the cliff, then you have the choice of like, am I going to stick around and watch and help clean up the pieces, or am I just going to walk away?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and revision control's a similar type of topic. When I first started using revision control, I used to ask my customer, if they wanted to do that. And a lot of them would say, I don't know what it is, or yeah, it sounds like a lot of extra work that I have to pay you for. I don't ask anymore. I do revision control on everything, whether my customer wants it or not. And I've been doing that for almost 20 years, maybe about 20 years. I can't remember when I started doing it exactly, but at some point it just made sense. There was no other way. Yeah. And so I don't even ask my customer's opinion on that anymore. It's like, sorry, I'm revision controlling everything I write.
So I watched a very interesting Dave Farley video. He runs the CI/CD channel on YouTube. Or I think it's a CD channel, continuous deployment or delivery or whatever. If you could go look him up. But basically he said, are you a waiter or are you a doctor, right? So like waiter, like somebody comes to you, they tell you what you want. Everything's predefined. Everything has a set price. And you just go away and come back with whatever it is they ask for. Versus, are you a doctor? The person comes to you and they have a problem and they ask for your advice. And you're like, okay, you need these 5 tests. Nobody pushes back at the doctor and says, no, I'm not going to do those tests. And I feel like some of the stuff like the tester and development and writing tests and keeping things clean and running VI Analyzer and all that stuff, I feel like a lot of that, like you should just do it because it's the thing to do and it should just be built into the quote. And
yeah, one of the things I learned early in my career, this is about mid-career. After I went back to, when I left Exabyte and went back to Sun, I kind of got out of the LabVIEW community for a while. Kind of got out of LabVIEW for a while and got more into Java. And I was on a really large development team at one point that had probably 100 people, not 100 developers, but some were managers, some were program managers. People writing things in all kinds of languages, mostly Java, but some C and some shell scripting and, various things. And I learned a lot of engineering practices in that scenario, how to use bug trackers, how to use revision control, and, the importance of process.
Yeah, you're very big on process. I like that.
Yeah. I think software engineering is really cool. And I really like to see, when I go into shops that do it properly, which, by the way, isn't very many. I'm really disappointed with corporate America's ability to use proper software engineering processes. Obviously, I'm not going to share any names, but I've gone into very large companies where they just don't have a clue how to do revision control, bug tracking, requirements gathering.
What do you attribute that to? Is that like ignorance on the part of the developers, which in the LabVIEW sense totally makes sense to me because they're not software people. But if you say you see it in other places, like part of me says it could be that, part of me says it could be management not like not understanding the value, or the developers not communicating it clearly, or?
LabVIEW tends to gravitate towards test. It doesn't have to. It can certainly be R&D and academia and other things, but it tends to gravitate towards test because of all the instrumentation that it works with. And I think test engineering is just a different place on the food chain than, say, design engineering. And I think design engineers, a lot of them look at LabVIEW as not even really a language, but just some tool or just some other thing that's not really a language. I know in the LabVIEW community, we all love LabVIEW, and we think of it as, our primary language. But I think if you get into design groups that are writing things in other languages, they probably have different. They probably have more discipline, because they've had a different career path than we've had.
Yeah, well, something you said was interesting. You said that some people look down on LabVIEW as a tool, but I've been of the opinion lately that all software is a tool, right? Like the people who are paying for it, they don't care that you write pretty software. They don't even care that you write software at all. They have a problem that they want solved. And there is a big movement, even in the software development community, of like no code, right? Like if you could solve the problem without writing code, why would you write code? Because it takes time to write it, and then you got to debug it, and then you got to maintain it. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there's so many tools now. I mean, we didn't have Git way back when, and we didn't even have Subversion. We had, like, when I was on Sun OS, we had like SCCS or RCS, things like that, command line revision control stuff, right?
Yeah. So one of the big challenges, I think, is the fact that there's so many things to know in the LabVIEW ecosystem, and just programs in general are so complicated, right? So if you're using LabVIEW, okay, well, maybe you're interfacing with TestStand, maybe you need to call some DLLs, you need to understand a little bit of C, maybe you're doing some networking stuff, maybe you're pulling something down from a web server, so now you got to understand HTTP REST stuff, and you got to understand JSON, and then you get into the process stuff, and like, you need to know some Linux command line to spin up a GitLab server, you need to know YAML to do the CI stuff, and it just gets really complicated really quickly if you look at like the whole process and the whole pipeline.
Yeah, hence my phrase, not that I coined it, but chief cook and bottle washer.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I've learned how to do my business from end to end, from finance to shell scripting on the web server.
Yeah, I've definitely done the same thing. I think one of my big shocks when I got out of corporate America, I worked for Westinghouse, and they had Bugzilla, and they had SVN, and this is kind of before I moved to Git. But they had all the servers set up for me, and then I started on my own. Like, great, I need a Bugzilla server. Well, how the heck do I do that? I need an SVN server. Well, holy heck! And so I had to learn all this Linux command line stuff, and like all this stuff that I never really thought I would have to learn.
Yeah, I have my own Git server. I had my own Subversion server for a while, and I actually wrote a bunch of scripts to convert all my Subversion repositories over to Git, and I did that about 4 or 5 years ago.
I think I was helping you out at that time.
Yeah, you were helping me a little bit with that, and it was a huge pain, and it took me a long time. But it's done, and I've actually preserved historically my 18 years worth of business from Subversion over to Git, and I just deleted all the Subversion stuff. I don't even have it anymore.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing. If you make the conversion, it's easy to just check all the code out and check it into Git, but you do lose all that history, and converting that history is actually a bit of a pain. I mean, there are some examples out there.
It was really difficult.
Yeah.
I ran, and it's like I'd get through. I don't know how many repositories I have. I'm going to say hundreds. I don't think it's thousands, but I
easily have hundreds. Yeah,
easily. And I would get through, like, I'd be making progress, and then one would just like blow up. For some reason I couldn't convert it, and I'd have to go debug it and figure it out. But anyway, I got all that done. But yeah, setting up your own Git server is not trivial.
Yeah,
most people just use GitHub or GitLab or some thing, and I don't like to host my code. I'm really into security too. So, I've got everything locked down pretty good. And now what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to deploy things via System Link, and I'm security conscious there too. I've got all the SSL certs. I also have my own LDAP server. So I use LDAP for authentication for all my customers. And I just containerize everybody. All my customers are separate. Nobody can get to anybody else's code. But I have a really rich history of all my customers' projects. And if I bring on subcontractors or employees or whatever, it's really easy to plug them in and give them access only to the customers they need access to, only to the projects they need access to. So it's very secure in terms of, like, a sub can't come in and just like look at all my stuff and take it all. You know what I mean?
As someone who's subcontracted for you, I will say your onboarding process is actually quite good. So
Yeah. And I've been, thank you, Sam. I appreciate you recognizing that because I've had some other people recognize that too. And it's something I'm really proud of. I've spent a lot of time on it. I mean, I've been working on my business for 18, 19 years now. So yeah, there's a lot to it. And anyway, my next frontier is really SystemLink. I've been working on that for about 2.5 years now. I've got several customers deployed on it. For those of you who don't know about SystemLink, definitely check it out on NI's website. There's way more to it than what I'm doing. I am mostly doing asset management and deployment type activities, but you can do a lot more than that.
So I have a question for you. So NI kind of sells SystemLink as this big enterprise solution.
Yeah.
What's in it for like smaller customers and small businesses? Like me as a consultant, if I go into some small company and they have like one LabVIEW project, like, is there value in implementing SystemLink, and what would I use it for?
So I think there is value in just kind of learning what it does and what it can do. If so, the sort of the traditional way of getting software to a customer, let's use LabVIEW. You can do, by the way, you can use SystemLink with TestStand, but in either case, you and I have deployed projects together. You build it in LabVIEW's case, you build an executable, you build an installer, and the installer is like a gigabyte or whatever, right? So it's like, okay, well, now I need an FTP server for my customer to get it from. Right. And if you're doing anonymous FTP, well, that's not secure.
Yeah.
So,
and then you got to set up the
or
security,
then you got to drive
manage it, and you got to get them the credentials, and
either that, or you drive over there with your USB drive and plug it in and install your installer.
Yeah, but that takes a lot of time.
And then their IT department's like, well, we got to scan your USB drive, right?
Yeah.
So cut to the chase, I deploy things through packages. Now you still have to build an executable, but you don't need to build an installer. You build a package. Now, with that, you don't really necessarily need SystemLink.
I was about to say I use packages, but I don't use SystemLink.
Yeah,
but packages are definitely much better than the installers. I highly recommend them.
Yeah. They're much smaller. They're 6 to 10 megabytes, something like that.
Well, they can also point to dependencies. So the installer had to include all the dependencies, but the packages just point to them in a package manager. So,
and
so actually, if they don't have all the dependencies installed, it will automatically figure that out and grab them for you. And
that's
it
right.
Keeps your size small.
Packages are the way to go for sure. And I've been using those for quite a while now. 6 to 10 megabytes probably isn't right. I've seen some that are more like 25.
But whatever
but in any case,
it's much smaller.
Better than a gigabyte and probably emailable, right?
Yeah.
And so now you can send your customer, hey, here's your new code. And that's fine. That's great. If you don't want to use SystemLink, do that. But I also like to manage. So I use what I call a lot of, air quotes again, crash machines. Crash machines meaning virtual machines that are basically destroyable.
Yep.
Like, oops, I broke it. Delete it and make another one. Right?
Yep.
So I use a lot of crash machines for each of my customers' projects to test my deployments on my crash machines before I give them to my customer. So I have a lot of virtual machines set up, and so I put them all in SystemLink. So now I have a lot of machines that I'm managing in SystemLink, and that's kind of my asset management. Like, hey, how many does this customer have? How many does that customer have? And how many of my crash machines have I added to their project? And now I can go and say, oh, I've got 1.0 version of this test software on that crash machine and version 2.0 on that crash machine. And kind of compare the differences live in real time.
Yeah.
And then, obviously the customer is only getting vetted, tested deployments.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. You bring up virtual machines because that was a whole other layer of complexity too that we have to add on to all our discussion of all the things to learn. Because that had a learning curve too when I first started.
I have terabytes of virtual
Yeah.
machines. Yeah.
And figuring out how to do it without like chewing up tons of hard drive space too, because there are like tricks to like, for example, with like NI Package Manager, like deleting all the cache so it doesn't start caching packages and like drive up your hard drive use. And there's a bunch of other little tips and tricks.
I have a whole process on managing virtual machines.
Yeah, that's what I was.
I haven't given a presentation on it yet, and I've considered.
Well, I think you did at Alarm a few years ago because
it was not. It was not a formal presentation. It was probably very like off the cuff. But yeah. I have a very formal process for managing virtual machines. Yeah.
Yeah. Mine's not as formal, but definitely you need like a naming convention and stuff to know like what's on each one and like a process for like cloning them and like not screwing up all the licensing on like Windows licenses and stuff. And like if you have, for me, I have like a whole bunch of utilities for my dev machines that I want installed. So I have to like take an existing one and copy it. But then I run into, if I haven't copied it in a while, then I could sit there and wait for Windows updates forever.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's a huge pain actually.
So I have clones. I have clones of blank, what I would call a blank clone.
Yep.
Windows XP, Windows 7, Windows 10, Windows 11.
Yeah, you got to manage LabVIEW versions and Windows versions.
So you keep your Windows
like a
primary clone, you keep those updated so that when you clone from it, it already has
Windows so if you're going to make a new one, you just launch the clone, update it, and then save it, and then clone it. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
But now once you have a bunch of those out in the wild, and you've got LabVIEW 2016 installed on this one and LabVIEW 22 installed on that one, you don't want to start over. Yeah. So now you're forced to do the Windows updates on your entire farm of virtual machines. And, if you don't have a life and you want to stay up all night doing that, that's fine. But I do them sort of on an as-needed basis. Yeah. Like if I'm actively engaged with a customer, I'm updating their machines and maintaining them. But if I haven't worked on a customer in 10 years, that virtual machine's not getting my attention.
Sometimes I just give up and I download the latest Windows ISO and just start from that rather than trying to update old ones. I'm just like, yeah. Because also too, like sometimes I'll have a project that's like an old project, but not exactly. And I'll copy that virtual machine, but then it has some extra crufty stuff installed on it and stuff. And you do that a few times, it starts to build up and you're like, why is this even on this virtual machine? Because I'm not using it. And like old hardware drivers and stuff and like third-party tools and things. I don't know if you get that, but I definitely get that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason for using virtual machines is not only are they just destroyable, like, oops, I broke it, but also they're very unique and custom. Yeah. Each customer project has its own set of tools and dependencies and things that it needs.
I really want to start getting more into Docker. There's definitely some challenges with it. Christian did a good presentation at GDevCon over in Amsterdam. I need to go back and review that. But it seems like he's cracked that nut and figured out how to do it. So I need to go take a closer look. Because I looked at it a while ago and there were a lot of barriers to getting it to work.
Yeah, I've looked at Docker a lot as well. And I just haven't got much traction on it yet.
Well, what I really want to do, I would love to switch to Linux completely. And I would like to have a Docker installation of Linux, and you could do the Docker installation and use X server and just have it forward the X server. And I think then you could use it and it would be like running it on your desktop, except it's running in a Docker container. Because you just have the GUI and interact with it. And that would be really slick. And then you could have like 10 different versions. You just spin up whatever Docker container you want, do the X forwarding. And the problem is all my customers want Windows for some reason.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've gotten any call to do LabVIEW on Linux or unless it's CREO,
Apparently NI is pushing Linux now a little bit more. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future
or Mac for that matter, which really is Linux, but
yeah. So you do have a lot of experience on Linux. I meant to mention that when you were talking about like setting up all these servers and running LDAP and all that stuff. So you have all that experience. So you got a leg up on the average LabVIEW developer.
I have a lot of IT experience in general because I worked at Sun Micro a couple of different times. And I learned a lot of IT there. I mean, it's just, that's kind of the environment that Sun was, and the nature of working in Linux. It's Windows is a desktop operating system and
you don't have to get your hands dirty on Windows if you don't want to.
Yeah. You can.
Linux, they've gotten better. Like Ubuntu's like pretty good now, but you still get your hands dirty a little bit.
Yeah, right.
Do you find that experience helps you with the new CREOs and the Linux RT? Because I find it's really helpful because I run into people all the time who like basically know Linux and they're trying to use a CREO and like they're just like fumbling and I'm like,
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely helped me on CREO. I don't do a lot of CREO projects. They come up every now and then. I did one recently, like last year, but it's not like my focus or anything. But yeah, I'm real comfortable on Linux, whether it's on CREO or anything else.
I'm very much getting there. So I feel like I'm like intermediate level. I know enough to be dangerous, but I there's still some things. There's some like things that I stub my toes on occasionally. So
there's a lot to it. And I certainly don't know all of it. I'm comfortable. I'm good, and I'm good enough to do what I need to do.
Man pages, that is the thing. I discovered this new alternative to man pages called TLDR, which is awesome. Because basically all it does is it cuts out all the man pages. It just shows you like 5 examples. Like if you want to use this command to do this, this is the sequence. And I find it's really useful because man pages are good, but man, they can be overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They can be. They're very dry and brittle or sterile. Sort of. Yeah. You know, I tend to reach out to things more like Stack Overflow and you know, where you get a lot of interesting answers to questions.
Yeah, well, I find that Stack Overflow is good, but I feel like you need some basic level of understanding when you pull stuff off there because, like, you know, the question is never exactly the same as your question, and so you have to like. Between Stack Overflow gives you the idea, and then you look in the man pages and you kind of figure out, okay, yeah, if I tweak it and add this flag, then I can do this thing. Because Stack Overflow doesn't always give you the explanation of why. It's just like, here, run this command. And you're like, yeah, do I really want to run a command I got off the internet, even if everybody says it works? Like,
Well, the other great thing about networking with people is, I mean, how many times have I called you and said, hey, Sam, you know, how do I do this thing? You know?
Yeah, we definitely have that in our community.
I call people all the time. I call my Java guys. I call circuit board guys. Whoever. I've met a lot of people in 30 years, you know, and I haven't kept in contact with all of them, but the ones that I have kept in contact, you know, they have special knowledge, and it's important to leverage your friends and colleagues' knowledge when you can.
Yeah, that is the power of having that big community. So I think that's a great note to end things on. I would love to talk to you some more. You and I will definitely talk a lot more. Maybe we'll do another interview in the future at some point. But it's been great having you, John.
Thanks,
really
Sam.
Enjoyed our conversation.
Really appreciate being here. Thank you very much.
That's it for today's episode of the LabVIEW Experiment. Thanks for listening. If you have any comments or questions, head over to thelabviewexperiment.com and drop me a note. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at @TheLVExperiment so you never miss an episode. And remember, small steps and quick feedback are all you need. Catch you next time.